Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're talking about the movie Gojira, also known as Godzilla, the original 1954 Japanese movie. We're going to be talking about how this movie, seen by most in the West as just a fun monster movie with a guy in a rubber suit, is actually a stirring tale about Japanese reactions to the World War II and the nuclear bombs. We're going to talk about why is it this movie has been seen so differently in America, and how we're currently trying to get a better understanding of that in a lot of parts of American society. And yes, we are going to talk about a guy in a rubber suit smashing miniature buildings. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over.
That was a person in a suit?
Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host, as you've already heard, asking about the great work of Nakajima Haru, the man in the suit. That was Paul Hoppy, who's joining me today. Paul, how are we doing?
Doing pretty good. Yeah, didn't get a ton of sleep, but just enough to give a note-free, but hopefully, impassioned and a little. Let's talk about this movie. I liked it.
No problem. This time I actually did a lot of research. And let me give a little bit of history of kind of how we decided to do this movie. First of all, with the strike going on, as I've said, we wanted to do some movies that are not about things made by American Hollywood companies, the companies that are currently being struck. And so Japanese cinema was a great thing to take a look at. If you pay attention to the Star Wars Universe podcast, you may see that Paul and I also did an episode about Japanese cinema over there, about The Hidden Fortress, a movie that's thought to have had a big influence on George Lucas in creating Star Wars. But with this one, for me, there was a further dimension in that right now there's a movie out that is talking a lot about the ethical decision-making of dropping the nuclear bomb. And the critique that's been brought about it a lot, I haven't seen it yet, but is that in a movie that's all about this horrific use of the nuclear bomb, we don't really pay any attention to the victims and their perspective in it all. And, I never really knew that much about Gojira. I used to always think of it as Godzilla, except that I thought it was a, fun, silly monster movie from the 50s that had this veneer of, oh, by the way, and Godzilla was caused by nuclear bombs, isn't that bad? And I thought, hey, you know what? A movie that's actually about kind of what that other Hollywood movie is about, but from the Japanese perspective, might be worth taking a look at. Turned out that I was very surprised, as I think a lot of Americans are, a lot of people who grow up with those kind of ideas about Godzilla, to find that this movie is actually a stirring and incredibly powerful, and in doing research, incredibly culturally significant moment of Japanese cinema coming to terms with, the horrible events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of the nuclear bombing, and all that means. That there's so much symbolism and meaning in the movie that I think a lot of people miss, and it's also just a great science fiction movie in that it uses those questions, uses that situation to ask some really hard questions about the kind of decision making that the scientists discussed in the other movie might have gone through. So we're going to talk about that movie. We'll give you a plot summary in a second, but the details of the plot are really not as important, I think, as the questions it raises. But let me just start with Paul. So what was it you liked about this movie?
I mean, first of all, it's a well-made movie in, 1954 standards, at least, right? But in terms of, I think the writing's good. I think the acting's good. I think production value doesn't matter that much when you have good writing and acting. And those are both things that when we cover the next thing we're going to cover, I'm also going to kind of talk about and double back to. And I love great production value, but I don't need something to be super fancy. It's like if you go see a play, it's not going to have quite the same immersive feel a lot of the time as going to see a movie, right? Because it's you're in a room with, a stage and you see the lights and stuff like that. And so here I feel sometimes it can take a little bit to kind of get invested, be like, all right, this is in black and white. I need my brain, I need something in my brain to click to kind of accept black and white as that's the world I'm looking at, right? Right. But then for me, usually between 5 and 10 minutes, I forget it's even in black and white. And I can think back on a movie and be like, oh, was that? Yeah. Oh, I guess that was in black and white, And I'll also just say I enjoy practical effects. I would rather watch someone in a suit actually stomp, cardboard houses or whatever than see not that good CGI. I feel like the thing with like CGI is it makes a lot of things possible that weren't really previously so possible, but it got really good, and then some of it's sometimes very rushed now, and I feel like it has more of a some maybe the uncanny valley kind of effect, but also just that feeling of like, I don't know, like here when I'm watching this, I wasn't thinking about the actual filmmaking, about like, someone in a suit stomping on buildings, and some of that's also thanks to editing and lighting and stuff like that, right? And being in black and white can be an asset sometimes, right? When the same way using shadows can be a tool that helps sort of obfuscate the unreality of what we're seeing on screen. So I enjoyed that. And also in terms of exploring things like these subjects, I'd rather not watch a biopic. Like I personally, I don't like almost any of them. The only exceptions that spring to mind are like about classical composers. Then I'm like, the music's just so good that it's like, the fact that it's a biopic, I'm like, yeah, whatever, but the music,
Amadeus is a great movie.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I saw a play of Amadeus too, with David Suchet as Salieri, and it was great, and it was like, but anyway, I enjoyed the movie. I appreciated things it was talking about. It did manage to like address something super directly in a way that didn't feel super contrived and preachy to me. And maybe some of that's because I'm reading subtitles and only catching a word here and there. There's always a little bit of like, if I don't fully understand the language being used, it's almost like when part of the part of the screen is in shadows, and it's like it kind of allows the mind to kind of fill it in. And I usually choose to fill things in with a way that I like it better, compared to when something's in English or even Spanish at this point, and like I understand all the words, and I'm like, oh, that was kind of an awkward way of saying that, wasn't that? Like, I don't want to be thinking that. That's just like, I can't help it. But so here, I can't think that, I can't criticize word choice. Like, sometimes I can be like, oh, they use a different word for thank you. So like, I could be like, oh, did they translate it correctly? Or are there like 5 different ways of saying, but yeah, for the most part, just like, it's an enjoyable movie. I think it can take someone who isn't watching a bunch of, 50s movies a minute to get into probably, but it's a good movie about interesting stuff. What else do I want?
Yeah, just a couple of things I want to say on what you said. First of all, it's interesting to note, to us today, I think the production values look quite low. This was one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time it came out, particularly in Japanese cinema, but also just in general. I believe it cost 750,000 yen to make, or it may have been $750,000. I don't remember, but either way, it was an incredible amount.
Yeah, that 750,000 yen sounds like about like 7 G's, I think. So
yeah, well, I mean, also
the other.
In 1950,
true,
all
of course,
stuff.
of course.
Forget a set of numbers.
Forget the number. A lot of money. It costs a lot of money.
And you're right. I think I really like the practical effects. They're a little cheesy at times. In the later movies, they get a lot cheesier, and I think they lean into that. But I know at the time this came out, people ran screaming out of the theaters. Like, it was pretty revolutionary in terms of some of the things it was able to do. And I appreciate also what a lot of the stuff you brought up about language and stuff like that. One thing I want to say from the beginning is I'm really interested in what this movie says to us today. And I think part of understanding that is also understanding the context of 1954 Japan and what it was saying at that time. I'm not Japanese. Paul isn't Japanese. And I want to be very aware of that in terms of making this discussion. There is some great analysis by Japanese authors that I will try and link to in the show notes. It's definitely worth checking out, some of which I read translations of, some of which I looked at. I will say that there were a couple of Japanese Americans who have been guests on this podcast before, or have been talking about being guests, who I've reached out to, none of which were able to make it for various reasons. But I still think there's a very worthy conversation to be had by two people who aren't in that culture, talking about what it means to us today, and also what it, our best understanding of what it meant at the time. And the context of it, because I think that is really important. So let me just start by giving a quick summary of the plot. We start, and there's a lot of things in here that are pretty significant as references to things, and some of them I'll mention now, some I'll mention as we go along. But we start out with a salvage vessel in the ocean south of Japan that is destroyed by what looks like a sudden light, and then is very quickly destroyed. No one really understands what happened. It happens to another vessel. More are sent to try to figure it out. They're all destroyed. And now people are starting to freak out and wonder what's going on. And we cut to a place called Odo Island, which is a fictional island, but there's certainly, Japan's as part of an archipelago. There's a ton of little islands near Japan that this is kind of made to represent. And on them, people are talking about what's going on. And one kind of, grumpy old man mentions that there used to be a belief in a legendary monster from the sea called Gojira. And so eventually, people are trying to study this. The Gojira appears and does some terrible things on the island, leaves behind some footprints. Scientists come to study it, and they find that it is radioactive. And more attacks, more research. The research is being led by, and I'm going to do my best with these names, but it will not always be perfect, a paleontologist named Kyohei Yamane. And he has a daughter named Emko Yamane. And he's trying to do research. He decides that it is probably a dinosaur or something that kind of, as he understands it, emerged from a period shortly after the dinosaurs. Interestingly, he talks about the dinosaurs as having lived 2 million years ago, which is, it's just kind of interesting to know that, and we now know it was more like 65 million years ago, if not longer. But, that it's kind of a nice reminder that the science that we now know about dinosaurs has advanced quite a lot, even just in the 75 years since 1954. So anyway, there's scenes of politicians discussing what should be done, and eventually this scientist concludes that it was probably a result of the testing of the hydrogen bomb that has happened quite recently by the Americans, although the word Americans is never spoken. There's political discussion about what to do about this. There's at least one politician who's very concerned that if they talk about this publicly, it will hurt their, quote, diplomatic relations. Again, America is never stated, but I think that's the very clear undercurrent. And the military tries to mobilize. They try to fight against Gojira. They completely fail. And Gojira eventually comes to Tokyo and just lays waste to Tokyo in a way that is very emblematic of the American firebombing of Tokyo. And it's shot in a way that is really heartbreaking in terms of both the destruction, but also then all the scenes of the aftermath. You see a mother and child about to die who talk about how they're going to be where their father is. The implication being that their father died, quite likely in the war, which was only 9 years ago, but not explicitly stated. There's a scene of a very young child and the kind of doctor testing him for radiation and finding that he's very radioactive. And again, it's heartbreaking. I definitely cried watching these scenes the first time. So along the way, two of the main characters who we've been seeing are the girl who I mentioned, Emiko, and one of the captains of the salvage ships, one of the people who's been involved in sort of learning about this from the beginning, Hideto Ogata, and they are in love, and they're trying to figure out what to do because she has been promised from a very young age to assign, as I said, she's the daughter of the paleontologist. She's been promised to this scientist who's a colleague of her father named Daisuke Serizawa, who has lost his eye in the war. But she doesn't really love him. She loves this other guy. They're trying to figure out how to tell him. Eventually, as it goes on, we learn that he has come up with something called the Oxygen Destroyer, which is this mega weapon, super weapon, very clearly a metaphor for hydrogen bombs, or like the next thing that would come beyond hydrogen bombs. And it could kill Gojira, but he doesn't want to use it because then other governments will try to use it. Even if he burns his notes, he might be coerced into using it. And the two of them, the couple who are in love, go and try and talk to him and convince him not to do it, convince him to use the weapon. He at first is against it, but then as they learn more and more about just how much kind of all of Japan is preparing to just be destroyed, and there's this prayer that's being sung all across the nation and symbolized by hundreds of Japanese schoolgirls in Tokyo singing this very sad prayer for peace, he decides that the weapon should be used. but that he's going to burn all of his notes, and pretty well foreshadowed, but it's still done in a very touching way. He goes down with Ogata to lay down the oxygen destroyer device to kill Gojira, but as part of it, he cuts his own line so that he can't be pulled up. He cuts his oxygen line so that not only are all of his notes destroyed, but he is killed as well, and in theory, the weapon can never be used. So Gojira is dead, but instead of it being like celebration and cheers, the movie ends on this very somber note that is clearly like sadness for the scientist, but also I think sadness for Gojira himself, who is seen kind of as a helpless, part of nature that was caught up in all this. And it ends with, and Paul, this might be, as you said, the part that feels a little on the nose, but I think actually really works. The older paleontologist, Yamane, saying that, if more nuclear testing is done, we're going to have more Gojiras.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I was actually saying that I felt like it didn't feel on the nose, even though it like super was,
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of me.
Yeah.
When I say that line,
Right.
It sounds super on the nose, but it didn't feel that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a big part of that is like just the movie's success at getting you to buy into its, its central conceit, its reality, and the fact that it is, I don't know, like for as unreal as it is, it feels very real. Because it is so, I don't know. I don't know. Just sometimes you could do this and it works, and sometimes you can do it and it doesn't. For me, anyway, right? And here it works. And yeah, I think the idea is that there's possibly a bunch of beings like this deep in the trenches in the ocean, right? And I do believe also this movie was made. I do believe this movie was made, but that, sea exploration has progressed a lot since then too, right?
Yeah.
In terms of like the ocean floor was less mapped than it is now, or I don't really know the state of sea exploration besides of like imploding, dirigibles. But anyway, go.
There is still a lot we don't know, and I think it's worth noting the movie Pacific Rim, which is a kaiju movie about monsters coming from the ocean.
Yeah.
Though in that case, through like a dimensional portal, it very clearly has some references to this movie, including in this movie, one of the things the military does is try to build like a huge electrified fence.
Yeah.
And Godzilla just smashes it right through it. And in Pacific Rim, they try to build a wall that the kaiju just smash right through. And I think that was a very intentional reference.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that wall was before the other wall that it could have been a reference to. But yeah, it's, the idea is that like, Gojira is not the only kaiju in the sea, kind of, right? And if you keep dumping nuclear bombs into the sea, like that can cause harm. And that's why Gojira is radioactive, right? And that's why all those kids have radiation poisoning. Like, and that, that's obviously a metaphor for the difference between like conventional weaponry or whatever and, atomic bombs, in that the destruction isn't confined to the immediate blast. And, and it's just, I don't know, it's interesting because it really does play as a metaphor, but then the weapon that Serizawa comes up with, is also like a metaphor for the same thing, kind of, right? And so I think all of that kind of ends up being like a metaphor for the arms race and for escalation. And you can unleash one new terror, and then if the counter to that terror is to unleash a new terror, it's like, where does this go? Right, exactly. Like nowhere good.
I think it's really true, and I think in understanding how much this is not only just like today we're like, oh yeah, I guess I can see how it's connected. Like it was a very powerful metaphor, but especially at the time it was made. I want to kind of highlight a few parts of that. First of all, as I said, it starts with these two boats getting destroyed, and where they see a flash of light, and they hear the sound, and then the boat suddenly erupts in fire. And when we watch it, we don't see Godzilla at all. And I think it's very easy to think, like, wait, was that... At first, I remember thinking, like, what we were watching was the nuclear blast that awakes Gojira. And And learning later, I learned that actually just a few months before they started making the movie, on March 1st, 1954, the Japanese fishing vessel Daigo Fukuyama Maru, which translates as Lucky Dragon Number 5, had been showered with radiation from the U.S. Atomic testing at Bikini Atoll. And one of those sailors had died, and so it was like very fresh in people's memory about, Americans testing more nukes and Japanese people dying. And those scenes of the ships were very evocative of that. The other thing I think that really comes through is that this movie is being made only 2 years after the American occupation of Japan has ended. And also very recently after the decision has been made to allow Japan to have a military again. And so the planes and the tanks and things like that we see, the planes and the artillery and stuff, is all very recently returned to Japan. And lastly, and very much as part of this, there had been a very long history, like the idea of free press, which we see a lot of reporters like very bravely on a tower that Gojira is attacking, and they keep talking about Gojira right to the moment that they are killed. But, there'd been censorship of the press, first under the Japanese government, then very much under the Americans, but also censorship of everyone, and there weren't things you couldn't talk about. And one of the things that I read a lot of was William Sutu, I think I'm pronouncing that right. One of the things that I read was a book by, I believe I'm pronouncing this right, William Sutui, author of Godzilla on My Mind, 50 Years of the King of Monsters. He's Japanese-American. He's done a lot of study on this, and he writes, Japanese creative artists, filmmakers, novelists, and so forth really couldn't talk about the atomic bombings. It was a topic that could not be discussed. And Japanese people as well were very reticent about discussing this tragedy because it was so horrible and because they felt a sense of guilt and shame about those events. But when the Japanese had their independence back, again in the ending of the American occupation, so 1952, just 2 years before this movie's made, when the Japanese had their independence back, as filmmakers were thinking about giant monsters, people began to think about that connection between monstrosity and the atomic bombing. And so he talks a lot, and in the book, he keeps talking about this idea that, like, this was kind of one of the first attempts to really wrestle with what did the bombing do to Japan, and how did people feel about it? Because for so long, you couldn't talk about it, both because of cultural issues, but also because literally, like, the Americans were censoring what movies could be made, and what newspaper stories could be written.
Yeah, I hadn't really. I was kind of wondering, like, I'm not super up on history of, like, wars in general, and I mean, I know when the war ended, I know when specific atrocities were committed, which I will insist and persist on calling them, and the sort of general timeline. But, like, in terms of, how long after the end of the occupation was this? Like, 2 years. That means people were thinking about making it before that or around then, right? I mean, movies take a while to make, although I think they were made a lot faster back then. But being less than 10 years after something like that, I mean, you think about, like, it's been 22 years since, like, September 11th in the United States, and, like, it's still very present in people's consciousness, I think, and in conversations. So for, terrorist attacks that are such larger scale and more recent, I think, I can only imagine how that would affect people. But also, I think the point about the like the first boat is really interesting, where, we're in the beginning, like, you don't see Gojira, like, for a while, right? Yeah. And in terms of, like, the bombs, like, you see a flash of light, you see the mushroom cloud, but you don't see the bomb, right? It's not people like, oh, what's that thing falling out of the sky? It's like, however, I mean, unless you're, like, just in the right place, I think, I don't really know, but that's my impression, right? Is that it's like the vast majority of people, at least, weren't, like, necessarily looking in that direction. And so this sort of like what even happened, sort of sense of that.
No, I think you're right. I think that, I know the author had interviewed a lot of people who were alive at the time. and a lot of those accounts have been kept, but obviously lost as because we're now so many years past it. But I think one of the things that becomes really most interesting is how this movie was viewed in America, and I want to talk about that a bit because I think it says something about also how powerful this movie was, which is that the movie was released in 1954 in Japan. 2 years later, an American company bought it and wanted to release it in America, but they not only did they dub it, but they reshot large parts of it. They added in American character, actually played by a Canadian actor, and so that character was a much bigger role. But also, they cut out all references to the atomic bomb. They cut out all the sort of things that would kind of implicate that the Americans were at fault in any way, or that any connections to the bombing. And this was like a big, and then this was a big part of what so Americans and by extension, I'm guessing a lot of the West knew about these movies. And to me, this is really interesting because I'll admit I'm one of those people as well. After this movie, like I think often happens, I think Rocky is another great example, but there's a lot of other examples where like people will make a movie where there's a spectacle, but it's really about like some really hard-hitting drama or ethical points or whatever. And then like people are like, okay, but those effects were really cool. Let's just do a million sequels about the effects. And there've been, as I said, more than 30 Gojira movies, a lot of which have, maybe some of which I think have some interesting points. Definitely Shin Gojira, which I think Riki and I are going to talk about at some point, definitely does. But a lot of them are just fun guys in suits, crushing miniature buildings and having a lot of fun with it, and big kaiju movies and stuff like that. And so, as I said, I had definitely always thought of this movie as, okay, it's a little bit of the atomic bomb, but it's mostly just going to be about, the effects and the coolness. And so my point being, and I'm kind of curious where you see this or like what you know about the movie, but to me, there's a direct connection between the way the movie is reshaped for American audiences and that kind of lack of knowledge of how much this really was about a commentary on this horrible thing America had done.
Yeah, I mean, that's American censorship for you, right? Where it's not state sanctioned, it's not forced, it's just let's take everything interesting about this movie, take it out, and then, keep the more superficial aspects and repackage it and, not ask people to give any thought to the actions of, their country and, the military of the country they live in. It's like you can censor things without having this governmental censorship, right? Although also like the MPAA is a censorship body. Just going to throw that out there, but yeah, I think I don't think I necessarily had a I don't think I had the same experience as you in terms of my perception of this movie specifically. I feel like the first time I actually gave it any thought, like when the movie Godzilla came out in the US, and I think there's a 90s one, right? 98. Yeah. We have a friend who was really into kaiju and into film. And so was that's when I found out there was Gojira, not Godzilla, and kind of the basic, what the because it's the original's the best because it does all this stuff, so it's sometimes these perceptions, it's well, what, where do you hear about something, right? Where's the first place that you're kind of asked to give something some thought? So I would say I kind of had some of that spoon fed instead of locked away in the liquor cabinet. But I don't know where I'm going with this metaphor. This is certainly not as seamless as the film. But
I can jump in just by saying further about the 1998 movie. I saw that one recently. It's really, really bad. But among other things, one thing I thought was really interesting was in that the thing that causes Gojira to awaken is French nuclear testing.
Oh.
And while granted, at the time they made it in 1998, the most recent nuclear tests had been done by the French.
Yeah.
Still, that felt like a very intentional, we're going to make this for American audiences.
Yeah.
No, the Americans didn't do this thing.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because 98, I would say, was almost sort of a nadir in recent history of American kind of gung-ho war kind of stuff, you know, like, right. But also maybe a sort of like, let's not think about any of that, because, you know, there was the Gulf War, right? But then after that, it was like, I don't think that was necessarily looked at super positively throughout the United States, you know, and there were no really high profile military conflicts until after '01. And so I think there was this period of maybe like, let's not think about America and war, even though, of course, America's always bombing somewhere or has troops on the ground here, there, and everywhere. But like, it's certainly less at that point than it was, you know, 5 years later.
Well, and also important to note is that, as I said, this movie is made shortly after Japan has remade a military.
Right.
And again, I'm not going to try to go too deep into this, but, you know, Japan was utterly devastated by World War II, both the American bombings. We know about the nuclear bombings, obviously, but I think a lot of people don't know that even before that, there had been, you know, carpet bombings where something like 78 Japanese cities had most of their downtowns and most of their areas completely destroyed. I think we think of the nuclear bombs as horrific war crimes, and I agree that they are. And it's hard to compare them, but like, for example, you know, it is estimated that about 80,000 people, including radiation deaths, died in Nagasaki. 100,000 people, at least, probably more, died in the firebombing of Tokyo. And I don't think there's any way to compare the two or to say, like, which is worse. That's not the point at all. But I think it's worth. I think it's easy to think, like, oh, until those two bombings, America had never done this kind of thing. No, we had done horrific things to cities all over Japan. And one of the things so I think there's at the time a very strong, like, you know, do we need a military? Do we want a military? That's a very divisive issue and the like. And I thought it's very significant that in this movie, the original, the military is completely useless. Like, they're good people. They're trying. The Coast Guard is helping. But all of the military attacks on Gojira completely fail. And it's only the scientist who can do it. Whereas in the American movie, the American military, rah-rah boys, is able eventually to destroy Godzilla. And I thought that was another very interesting, like, because doing some more research, Honda, who was the director of this movie, I couldn't find if he's connected to the Honda automobile family at all. But he was, among other things, a Japanese war veteran. He'd been a pacifist. He didn't want to go. He got drafted. He hated the war. And one thing I learned was that when the Americans would, like, you know, because all the Japanese troops overseas surrendered, and so the Americans would bring them back to Japan, they had them land and go through Hiroshima because they wanted the Japanese to see, like, just how much Japan had been defeated. I guess in this attempt to sort of, like, you know, teach you, like, your military should never exist again, that kind of thing. And it was, again, quoting from the book by Sotui, it had a lifelong impact on him, the horrors of what he saw, and they decided an opportunity with this movie to set an important political message.
Yeah, it's, you know, this is, I mean, this kind of, it sort of complicates what I would say about things in terms of, like, you know, you look at the war and, like, you know, we covered Ip Man, you know, which is a movie that takes place in the context of the atrocities committed by the Japanese military against China. And it's, you know, I think it's like, there's like three things here in terms of, like, sort of dealing with sort of, you know, the results of the war, right? There's, like, one, being in a country and maybe fighting for a military that has committed its own atrocities. Like, right. You know, that's something that you can't paper over. You can't deny that. Like, horrible, horrible things were done by the Japanese military. And then there's, you know, the specific atrocities committed by the American and allied military. I don't know how, was it just the U.S. military at that point? I mean, I know the Red Army was, like, actually probably ready to invade Japan soon. But
they actually declared war. This was coincidental because Stalin had promised to declare war 3 months after the surrender of Germany.
Yeah.
But they declared war in between the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And the English were certainly a part of some of the fighting. Certainly, English soldiers and also Australian and Indian soldiers were very much part of a lot of the fighting. And English Air Force was very committed to this same strategy of carpet bombing, and I believe it was English bombers that had done a similar thing to the city of Dresden in Germany, and killed, I think like 50,000 plus people or something like that in one night. I don't believe any English bombers were actually part of these attacks on Japan, just because they were so focused on fighting Germany, and it was mostly the Americans there. But yeah, the other countries were involved in the fighting, to be sure. Right.
So, yeah, and I mean, I think there's some question on how much it was coincidence in terms of the timing, right? In terms of like, I think there's an argument to be made that like Truman didn't use atomic weapons on Japan to get a reaction out of Japan. It was
I think that's right. Yeah, I more meant that like it's not that Russia saw
I see. Yes.
And gotcha. All of a sudden was like, hey, let's attack Japan.
Right. No, it was like it was scheduled. It was on the calendar. Yeah. But so there's the atrocities committed by the Japanese military. There's the atrocities committed by the U.S. military, and we can get more specifically into that. And then there's like losing a war, right? And sort of what that does to a national psyche, or also just the conditions of being occupied, which China and Korea had just experienced as on the other end,
right.
And so that's a lot of kind of emotional baggage that I think different people are going to carry differently, right? Like, and it could have to do with like, what was your role in the war? What were your views on war in the first place, in general? And I mean, the context for me of learning about all this, like in school, I feel like in history class, I don't feel like a lot of attention was paid to any of this. There's this kind of like hand wavy, okay, this happened on this date, this happened on this date, this many people, were killed in Hiroshima in like August 6th, and this many were killed in Nagasaki and on August 9th. And they don't even really tell you about Tokyo and like the other Japanese cities that were firebombed or carpet bombed, or it's like mentioned, but like there's not a big discussion about it. But I will say that I'm appreciative that when I went to Bank Street School for Children, this is like very alternative kind of school. And I had one teacher who was, she actually ran like a club called like the Asia Society or something, where that's where I learned to make kappamaki and what kappa means. And, and like, I think as a result of some things she said, I read, a short story that I don't remember the name of it. I just remember it was about this girl who had survived one of the bombings and had radiation poisoning, radiation sickness, and made like 1,000 paper cranes because like you're supposed to like get a wish, and right. I think she wished for peace, and then she died of radiation poisoning. And this was like, I think this was like the 4th or 5th time in my life that I was like, just like, what's wrong with people? Like, the first being like when I found out, like, how humans treat animals, I was like, what? Like, no, that's not okay, And then, growing up in the US, you learn about slavery and you learn about the Holocaust. And I feel like those are things, though, and genocide of native peoples. And like, those are things that I think if you're in the US, it's easy to be like, well, that was history. That's how this country started. And now, like, we can, move forward because we've gotten over those things. And then later you learn, like, maybe we haven't, like, really gone all the way forward from there. But the reactions and just the attempts to justify just the murders of, like, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of civilians, both in the, in the nuclear attacks and in the ones that preceded those. It just, I don't know. When I hear that, I'm just like, I feel like that was kind of the moment that I was just like, yeah, I'm not American. Like, I was born here, But like, this is my sort of like, habitual asterisk to your we. But like, I think there are just times when you can just hear something and being like, I don't want to be a part of that, Yeah. And like, not obviously like all these things happened like, it was after, but my mom was born, but my dad wasn't born yet, so it's like, in the we or not we or whatever, it's like, yeah, sure, of course we weren't there, right? But it's like just the attempt to justify some of these things and like not act like they're atrocities and terrorism, like that. I mean, because that was the plan, right? The plan was terrorism. I know there were factories and small factories and this and that, and like, sure, there's details, but for me, the details don't make it actually complicated. They're just details.
I recently read it on audio tape. Which actually is the way it's made. It's better to read. It's called The Bomber Mafia by Malcolm Gladwell. And it's really about sort of these two different schools of bombing in America and in England. One of which was precision bombing, and the other which was, this kind of carpet bombing. And part of it was that there'd been all these great theories about how good precision bombing could be that didn't work out. And that was part of why the move was to just indiscriminate carpet bombing like this. And there was a lot of horrible reasons for it, but it is well documented that they called it morale bombing. And that part of the idea was that, like, you had to destroy the people and destroy their will to fight. And a lot of that is also wrapped up with it. I think a lot of Orientalist and kind of racist ideas about how Japanese just people think differently and like they're never going to surrender and this kind of thing. And I think there are Japanese scholars who've written more on the Japanese perspective on it that are worth checking out. That again I can't comment on. But I definitely think you're right that there is. We're getting way into a tangent here, but I guess it's not even a tangent because it's very related to the question of this. And I'm okay saying the word Oppenheimer. That the whole
right. That was a real person who lived and we're allowed to talk about.
Yes, and mention the movie because I don't think this is us promoting it.
Sure. Oh, was there a movie?
Again, I haven't seen it. It might be great. I don't know, but I think to me it was really telling that movie. It's all about this decision to use this weapon or not. Does involve the people who it was used on. Yeah. And that's why I thought this movie was so striking, is because the exact opposite.
Well, it doesn't show a lot of Gojira, suffering at the hands of the oxygen destroyer, but anyway.
Right. Well, let's get to that
a little bit. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said there.
Sure.
I think because what I was always taught was, yes, the use of the nuclear bomb was terrible and horrific, but every other option was worse. That it would have caused far more civilian deaths and American soldier deaths if we had invaded, and all these kind of justifications that are used that I think, as we've looked at it more and more and understood the rationality, kind of don't make any sense anymore. But to me, it's really interesting seeing how the movie is really wrestling with that, because as you said, like, it shows all these different perspectives. I don't think the movie is clearly trying to say, like, it has clear things to say about nuclear weapons, but I think it is very ambivalent about what should the Japanese reaction to this all be. And that, like, there's one at a lot of points where a lot of people are super scared and are doing everything they can to react. There's one character who just says, evacuate again, I've had enough. And I think that's a clear reference to the multiple times people, and this, in London and in many cities that were attacked by the Germans and the Japanese, but then also many cities that were attacked by the English and the Americans and others. They had just night after night go to these bomb shelters, go into subway stations, try and hide from the bombing.
Yeah, and I think you just hit on why it works for me, is that, they don't give you an answer. They don't tell you how to feel about it. They just present it, and for me, that's always what's going to work best. And it's there are characters who have viewpoints and express those viewpoints. And so you can see almost like a buffet of reactions that you can either choose from or you can empathize with. And hopefully if you have one reaction, you can empathize with someone else's reaction and understand, like, look, I don't have to feel the way you feel about this, or you don't have to feel the way I feel about this. And that's okay, in terms of, like, and by this, I mean, like, if you are Japanese in Japan at the time and this has happened, right? And it's like you get to feel how you feel. And I mean, the movie's not like trying to say that in like really explicit terms, but it's letting you do that. It's not You know, I don't feel like at the end there's what Serizawa did was like definitely the right thing to do. It was like he made that choice, and, you know, it was, I mean, maybe there's a feeling that it's like, yeah, if you don't do something about Gojira, like, it's just going to keep stomping all your cities. And like, maybe that's true.
Yeah.
You know, but like, I don't feel like it's like this is the only way, everybody has to agree. Like, it's like, this is what we're doing. This is what we did. You know, Daisuke decided I can't survive, or they might convince me to, you know, it's basically like the ego of a scientist is such that upon making such a discovery, and then other people knowing about that discovery, like, how can one resist the urge to tell everyone all about how brilliant they are, basically, right? And here he's like, no, I'm going to take that secret to my watery grave. And I did think that was like super telegraphed. I was like, as soon as you're like, and scientists can be convinced, I'm like, oh no, he's gonna pull a what was that character you played? I don't know.
Yeah, he definitely was. I think that was made very clear.
Yeah.
There's a couple things in what you talked about I want to say. First, I love what you said about how, like, it doesn't really give answers to these questions. I think, and again, especially from what I've read about the cultural significance of the movie in Japan, what it really did was not only did it not give answers, but it was kind of one of the first times that it gave permission to ask the questions and to talk about it, you know, and it started these conversations. And again, this is me going on research of others, but I think both about, like, what had happened to them and also their role in, like, you know, what had Japan done. And one thing I'll say that, and this is kind of maybe another topic for another time, but I do take a very different perspective to being American than you do, in that I think I am equally as horrified by a lot of the things that the Americans have done. I think for me, I'm not able to say, so that's something they did. They're not, because I'm not an American. To me, I get all the benefits of being American in terms of, you know, all that means. My tax dollars do go to support America. It is tax dollars given under coercion of violence, as you pointed out to me. But because for me, the way it matters is the reason it's the same reason why I talk about, like, I am Christian, even though I'm horrified by what so many Christians do in the name of Christianity. Because if I just say, oh, those aren't real Christians, then I don't have a responsibility for it.
Right.
But to me, by claiming myself as an American and naming that, it's a way of saying, like, we're still here. But also it's a way of saying, like, it's my responsibility to help make my country stop doing these things, because I am part of it, and I can't just say I'm not. So, and just to give a counterpoint, like I said,
sure. That's to give your perspective and your own feelings, which
and all I'm saying is, but I think that's, to me, I think that's a part of what's happening in this movie as well. Is it's also like what I was really struck by is that there was a real sense of shame and debate about, is that about shame for starting the war, or even if that was believed that, you know, who was responsible for starting the war, shame that we lost the war, that Japan lost the war or surrendered, whatever it was. You know, and I think that, again, there's so much scholarship on that I can't summarize by any means, but just the way that this movie was able to open all those questions and give people in Japan and later in America and all over the world the chance to really wrestle with them, I think is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to, kind of like what I think are two of the more interesting, like, specific ethical questions in the movie. And first, I think, because you mentioned Gojira's own suffering at the end of the movie. What was your take on Gojira as a character?
I felt like, you know, you didn't get any sense of, like, Gojira's, like, motivation or, like, you know, and that's fine, because, like, you know, doesn't speak Japanese, so it was hard for the characters to have a conversation, right? But I did appreciate that, you know, Dr. Yamane was like, no, we should study Gojira's, like, ability to resist radiation. I'm not quite sure how he, like, intended to do that, but, like, the idea of, like, no, you see something you don't understand, it doesn't mean you just go and kill it. Right. And it feels to me like they didn't really, I feel like there are maybe some more creative ways of being like, okay, can we draws this thing's attention away from where he's going. Like, can we create some sort of power source that will make him like go over here, back into the ocean? Like, why is Gojira here? And like, as opposed to just like kill. I will say, like, when it comes to killing animals, if they are currently trying to kill you, I kind of like, I'll respect that as a carve out of like, if you can't come up with an idea of like how to non-violently or non-lethally stop them from killing you, like, sure, okay, self-defense,
right.
So, that's, it's a little different than like, oh, there's, this creature in the sea, we're going to go and kill it because we're afraid of what it might do. It's like, no, it just leveled Tokyo, which was just rebuilt, like, it's like, come on.
And I think it's really telling that Gojira is not presented as malevolent or evil or like sadistic. This is a version that a lot of people may not get, but like in Magic the Gathering terms, these different colors represent like different ideas, and green is the color of nature, where nature doesn't have like, it's not evil, it's not, but it just is. It's just it's animals.
Yeah.
And I think Gojira is very much presented as that he's an animal, and he does present a threat, and so there's a certain self-defense aspect, but there's to me, the fact that the movie feels so tragic at the end, and then we get this last beautiful shot of like the ocean with the light of the sun on it, it's very evocative of like when Gojira first emerged. I at least got the sense that the movie was saying, like, it is tragic that the scientist had to die, but it's also really tragic that, like, we got to a place because through our human malfeasance of nuclear weapon testing, we awakened Gojira.
Yeah.
And then he, was crazed and fought back, and we had to then kill him.
Right.
Or kill it. Or whatever.
Or chose to.
It's interesting that Gojira is gendered as male. Even in later movies where Gojira lays eggs.
Right. Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that. I was like, and I don't like saying it or thing or whatever, but I'm also like, I don't feel like gendering Gojira because I'm like, I feel like if there was a clear biological setup that would be very large and on screen. So,
Yes, exactly. Censorship still was a thing, though, and probably a good thing.
Right. See, I don't know. I'm sure that's a class of,
There's a lot of fan fiction that will definitely tell you that. That's all you need to know.
Or even animation. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, I definitely got that sense of like, that there was a real tragedy here that Gojira had to die.
Yeah. And, and it's like blended with sort of undercut, sort of like with Saritawa's, death, right? And but it does feel like the whole thing is a solemn event, which feels more appropriate to something like this than like people cheering. And maybe there are people cheering also at some point, I'm not sure, but I can't. I watched the movie one time and it was like a week or two ago, but
I watched it again this morning. I think there's some cheering when they think they've defeated him with the military,
right?
But at the end, it's all the people on the boat and then everyone else, because it just ends with them on the boat.
Back to Japan. They don't have a bunch of other, and then Yamane says like, if we keep, if the U.S. keeps dropping bombs on Bikini Atoll, like things are we're gonna get more of these, right? Like, because it wasn't like the bomb created Gojira, like the bomb awakened Gojira and kind of gave Gojira like superpowers or radioactivity.
Yeah, I think it's really accurate, and I think one of the things that's most interesting about Gojira is how in later movies he becomes the savior of Japan. That a lot of the movies later, especially the Gojira verse, whatever other monster, Gojira is the one saving Japan from these big monsters.
Right.
And often stepping on some buildings along the way.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
And at some point, I think very recently, Gojira has been declared an official cultural ambassador for Japan by the Japanese government. And I think there's I didn't get a chance to dive into these as much as I wanted to, but there's a lot of really interesting scholarship on sort of how is it that Gojira went from this monster that attacks Japan to becoming like a symbol of Japan. It's something Japanese really relate to, and I think the both dangerousness and the victimhood is really kind of a part of that. So let's go to the other. Oh,
sure.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, like, do you know whether future movies are sequels and there's like new, Gojiras, or like, are they sort of like reboots where it's like, okay, how about in this one, Gojira doesn't get killed and like not sure, there's a whole bunch and it's probably complicated is certainly an acceptable answer to me.
That's definitely a question that kaiju experts get into a lot of debate about.
Okay.
My understanding is that the movies put out by the Toho Studios, which is the studios of movie, are kind of in some ways the first, or at least one of the first connected cinematic universes.
Right.
And that Godzilla does appear again later, and that I think that they said that, like, yes, this is supposed to be in the same continuity. As much as that were, I mean, at a time when you went to see a movie once and then really didn't have a way to see it again and again on TV or VHS or DVD or anything like that, the idea of continuity is much because people are thinking about, like, oh yeah, that movie I saw 10 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're a lot of those movies build on each other, and I think there was some statements that it was a new Gojira that emerged for later movies, and certainly that, like, there'd be a movie that introduced Mothra, and then Gojira and Mothra would together fight this three-headed monster from outer space, and that there were all these sort of things, and eventually Gojira gets a son, who I haven't seen yet, but the animation looks utterly, like, just ridiculously ugly cute in a way that I absolutely love. So I think that's going to be a fun thing to check out. But yeah, they are kind of all connected in that way, or at least a lot of them are. But I think not in, like, you don't have people going on the internet being like, oh, but remember at minute 57 in the first Gojira movie this happened. And that doesn't fit with this other thing. I think it's more kind of like the continuity of comic books. Like, they're all kind of the same, but they're not trying to have the exact same stuff.
Right. It's sort of like pre toxic canonicity to borrow something from a previous episode we've done where I'm definitely. Like, I like, you said something, I'm sorry, tangent land, but you said something when we appeared on Hype Is My Superpower, which I say appeared because it was recorded like a month or two ago, but it's probably not been released yet. I don't know. But there's going to be an episode that we're on talking about something. I don't even remember what we talked about, but I'm sure it was fun. But you mentioned how, like, in the Bible, there's like two stories that, like, they say one thing and then the next thing says something different. And it's just like, deal with it, and like the idea that, like, these are part of the same universe, but like, they don't have to be, not everything. They don't have to be completely consistent, right? Because that's like not the point of the stories. And to me, like, I wouldn't mind a Star Wars where, like, it's not like, this is the one true thing that happened. It's like, no, here's a story. Here's another story. They complement each other, but they don't necessarily have to correspond perfectly. And so I appreciate that if that's in these movies as well. Yeah,
for sure. So let's talk about what's probably the biggest ethical question in the movie, which is Serizawa, the scientist, his decision event, his at first refusal to use the oxygen destroyer machine, and then his decision to use it, but to kill himself and destroy all his notes in the process. What did you think of that as how the movie played out at the end?
I thought it was, it's interesting because it's like, I think a lot of people like to, kind of blame the scientists and be like, oh, if you didn't do these things, we wouldn't have these weapons, right? And like, that's true in the same way, like, if you say to soldiers, well, if you didn't fight, we wouldn't have wars. It's true, but it's like, it would have to be collective action, Yeah. And I feel like science is eventually going to present all the ways of killing. Because, as you increase your understanding of reality, you find more and more ways that aspects of that reality can be, turned into death, basically. And so I think the idea of like, well, okay, I'm going to use this thing this one time, and then I'm going to destroy my notes and myself, and nobody's going to be able to figure out how it worked. I think is naive. You know, I think it's a heroic thought to say I'm going to sacrifice myself so that nobody uses this for ill. But
right.
but someone else is gonna figure it out. They're gonna be like, oh, you called it the ox. Like if that were my plan, I'd be like, I'm not telling you what this thing's called. I'm not telling you it's the oxygen destroyer. Then you're gonna go thinking, oh, how can I destroy oxygen? Like I'm not even gonna mention that part. You know, be like, it's the Gojira destroyer. It's proprietary, and I'm giving you none of the details. I might kill a few fish too. And you know that Gojira was like the military target, but they killed a lot of fish too. I'm just gonna put this out there. But like, you know, and that's like a metaphor that I think maybe only a small number of people are really gonna feel. But like, you know, or maybe not. Maybe it was very deliberate. I'm not sure.
I think it was. I think though a little bit from an animal rights perspective, more so though. I think because at that time, you know, fish was and is a huge part of the Japanese diet.
Sure.
And we were coming, you know, it was only fairly recently that there had been like, you know, huge food shortages because of the war.
Right.
But also, I think this is less so the case today, but still the case today, but certainly time the movie was made, a huge part of the economy.
Yeah.
And they specifically say that like, even when Gojira is just killing all the fish and stopping all the fishing boats, that's hurting the economy. So I think if there's like one part of, oh no, the animals, and one part of like, oh no, all of us who depend on the animals.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like the phrase "stopgap" is coming to mind, but that's not quite what I mean. But like, basically, a kicking the can down the road, being like, okay, humans, somebody's going to figure this out, but it's not going to be directly because of me. Right? It's not, they're not going to find my work. They're going to have to start over from scratch. Someone else is going to have, you know, the kind of light bulb moment. And again, that's why I think probably don't mention the name, you know, but like, but yeah, I mean, it's both, I think, admirable and naive, you know, and that's not to say like, if we draw a parallel like that, you know, the scientists who worked on the, you know, the Manhattan Project and other nuclear projects throughout the world, that's not to say like, oh, well, if they didn't do it, someone else did, or someone else would, so like they don't have any culpability, you know?
Right.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it as a, well, you're off the hook because someone else would have done it anyway. Just, you know, I think it is worth understanding, like, yeah, you did this. I do hold at a higher level of responsibility, you know, the people who chose to, you know, metaphorically pull the trigger on it, right? Either signing off on the program or saying, let's blow up a couple cities, you know? I mean, you know, Harry S. Truman, I think, gets off easy, you know, and people who flew the bombers, although, like, I don't know how much they knew about what was going to happen, or they're just like, we're just dropping a bomb, I don't know. Which I think actually was dangerous for them too, right? Because of the radiation. Not like, oh, poor them, but just like, you know, the specifics of it. But yeah, it's like, you know, it's like, yeah, you're responsible. It's probably would have happened anyway, eventually, right? But you're still responsible. So,
in a lot of ways, this is going to be a weird connection, but follow me, I think it makes sense. It's part of why I think what Galen Erso does in Rogue One
I was thinking
is
the
so
same
important
thing.
Because I think he's placed in that similar situation where, you know, the Empire thinks he's the only scientist who can do this. He has to come back.
Right.
And I think you can argue, well, he should have just been willing to die. He should have been willing to let his family die because otherwise he constructs this thing that literally destroyed an entire planet, could have destroyed so many more. But his argument is kind of the exact reversal of the ego argument. His is like, no, I am really good, but if they kill me, they'll find someone else to do this. And so it's going to be made. I can at least make it with this trapdoor safety thing. There's a lot more to that discussion. I think we can talk about it at another time.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think there's a little hubris there. I think it's, you know, it's interesting to note, soon after America first dropped the first nuclear bomb, a number of other countries within 10 years, Soviet Union first, and England and France, and eventually China figured out how to do it. And I think part of it is they had been doing their own research beforehand, certainly, but also the extent to which once one person has shown that it can be done, maybe you steal their notes, and that's the whole thing with there's all sorts of debates about that with the Soviet Union, but also just like it's a lot easier to decide to put huge amounts of money into a research project if someone's already shown that it works.
Right.
And I think that's like you said, a lot of other places might be like, oh, okay, well maybe we shouldn't use this weapon. Maybe why would I even try to research an oxygen destroyer? Wait, it works. Yeah, exactly. Now I'll put money into it.
Yeah, it's proof of concept.
Yeah. And I think I'm with you there. And I think the movie's intentionally very it is intentionally very obtuse about how do you feel about this, because, and I think that very plaintive prayer by the Japanese girls is very intentional, that they're trying to set up the literal existential threat that, this is, it's easy, as you said, to talk about the like, well, should we build this weapon for a threat that might happen in 5 years? People are dying every day right now because of Gojira. The country is at risk. The world is at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, what's interesting, and I don't know if this is just my American lens seeing this, or if this was intentional by the filmmaker, I feel like they set up the same situation that the Americans claim as their justification. Because that's the American claim as well, is that it was a horrible thing to do, but this was literally the best way to end the war, because any other way would have caused so much more death and so much more chaos. And we can question that today, but I think that it's interesting that that's a similar question that the movie sets up of, can we use this terrible weapon knowing that... Because I think in the end, I think I'm on team you use the weapon. Like, I hate it. And I agree with you. I think it's going to lead to more terrible things. And that's kind of the point at the end, is the statement of that, like, we have to all decide to stop. I mean by that, use the weapon on Gojira, not use the weapon on Japan.
Excellent clarification.
Yes, thank you. I saw your face. I was like, yeah, being very clear here.
I was like, I think that's what you mean, but like, we probably want to make sure. Yeah, good.
Right. Because, like I said, I think in the self-defense aspect of doing it has what has to be done. But I think that's the statement at the end, where he's saying, like, yes, we had to use this weapon because of this thing that's already created by a weapon. But even just destroying the notes and destroying the scientist isn't enough. We have to all agree to stop trying to figure these things out. We have to all agree to stop nuclear testing.
Yeah, I think it is a super deliberate parallel there. I mean, yeah. It was one of the things that felt like this really could have felt too on the nose, but somehow it works, And I do think it's interesting that this movie and Hidden Fortress had like a song, because what you're describing as a prayer is delivered in the form of a song, right? It's these children singing, and that this song sways this character who had not agreed to help the protagonist, but then decided to help the protagonist. And like, I'm just like, oh, this is interesting. This is like very, very similar, like just like the same point in the movie. And which also I think was the Hidden Fortress, I think also was done by Toho Studios. But and then is why Kurosawa went and made his own production company after that. Because they're like, you film too slow. And
I know that Kurosawa and Honda were friends. They both worked at the studio together. Yeah. And then because Honda was drafted, but Kurosawa was not. Honda was kind of mad that he came back from the war, and Kurosawa had kind of established himself already as a film.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, so it's like, I do think they are deliberately, setting up that parallel, and then allowing the viewer the space to have their own feelings about it. And I appreciate that. I just always appreciate that in a, it's fine for something to like mostly have a perspective, but I feel like, I think it's way more powerful, instead of being like super preachy constantly, to basically present something and then just like give the viewer space. I think when people are really going to have moments where they have this realization of like, oh, this isn't okay, or like this is, I should be doing this, or like, oh, that's how things are. I don't think it's usually from someone giving a monologue. I don't think it's usually from a speech, right? I think those are things to kind of like rally people who are already on your side, right? Like the preaching to the choir, metaphorically. But I think setting up questions, I think film is a great medium for that, where, you know, you give people some ideas, you present people with some ideas, and then you let them feel what they need to feel and let them think what they need to think. And I think just in general, you're a lot more likely to actually convert people to your point of view than if you're just, you know, malleting them over the head with something.
Yeah.
And I think this film does a great job of that.
So there's one piece of listener feedback I want to get to, and then in the Patreon section, we're going to talk about one last part of this movie and how it plays in other movies, the love triangle, which I know me and Paul have some thoughts on. But first, Paul, let me just give you a chance. And the last things you want to say about this movie.
Not so much about the movie, but just, I don't know. I still, like, I look up things about, you know, American opinion on things like Hiroshima and like Nagasaki, like the, you know, those bombings. And I mean, it would be interesting to see a polling of how many people even have any idea of, you know, the conventional bombings that took place before that. But
yeah,
and just seeing the amount of support that still exists, you know, is it's just like deeply disturbing to me. And like even just like thinking about or talking about these things, like, it, like, I don't know. I mean, I, you know, didn't break down, but it was like I found it difficult to speak earlier, you know, talking about like the first time that I heard about these atrocities, which I just really want to underscore. Like, I feel like if you refuse to recognize them for the atrocities that they were, and if you think they're like really morally ambiguous or even justified, like, I just don't think that's being realistic. Like, that's how it's sold a lot of the time, right? Like, I just think that's drinking the Kool-Aid. Like, I think that's buying a giant pile of feces that post-war America has sold to you. And I don't know. I think people should question how they acquired such a ridiculous viewpoint and like why they remain so attached to it. And, you know, it doesn't mean like you have to like think that things were necessarily simple, right? Because, you know, they weren't necessarily simple, but it's like, I don't know, you just don't do this. Like, it's just not okay. And that's that's all I have to say.
To me there's two things there. One is, I'm really glad you brought up the point about the censorship, because, you know, I think that what happened to this movie and this story when it got to America is really emblematic of the ways we, you know, don't want to think about that. And so we took this piece of media from a country we've done these horrible things to, and then just took out all the parts about the horrible things and made it just a fun movie about, you know, a guy in a rubber suit smashing a lot of buildings. And but I wanted to point out, by the way, I mentioned the name of the actor before, Nakajima Haru. He's wearing a 200-pound suit.
Oh wow!
So let's tip our hat to that. Like, if you ever think like, oh wow, he looks so stupid, he's moving so bulky. He's wearing 200 pounds of rubber.
That's rough.
And this is before like cooling systems and special effects stuff. Like that's.
And as someone who once wore a boat, I imagine some perspective on, you know. I did wear a 40-pound boat for a summer job once that has faded into memory. So thank you for bringing back that trauma. But I think that's really significant of. You know, because the movie, like we said, is pretty, like, at one point they specifically mentions that she had just escaped Nagasaki, and now she's 9 years later, in danger of this bomb, things like that. And I think it's really important to look at that, to look at, like, why is we're taught the things that we are. Like, and this kind of leads to the second point. I think it's really important, the way you phrased it, that we acknowledge these multiple truths, that Japan committed atrocities in the war. We committed atrocities in the war. And you don't have to say, well, one of them is worse than the other. You don't have to say that one of them justifies the other. They're both true. And for me, the connection there is that I had certainly learned quite a lot about the atrocities that Japan had committed during the war. But I learned about the atrocities Japan committed to white people. The Bataan Death March, which is often talked about, where American prisoners of war in the Philippines were horribly treated. Similar things happened to British troops in Singapore and Hong Kong and other places like that. But the
the just utter destruction that was done to the Chinese city of Nanking never was talked about. The horrific atrocities that were committed to the Chinese people, to the Korean people. You pointed out that actually a huge number of Koreans died in the bombing of Nagasaki.
Yeah, thousands.
Korean immigrants to Japan lived.
Well, just a point of order. Not immigrants, conscripted laborers, like slaves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this wasn't like people who were like, I'm going to move from Korea to Japan because that seems like a nice thing to do. Okay. This was... which I think makes it a lot worse even. Not that it would be okay, but like...
During times of empire, people in like the outer colonies often moved to the main area because there is a shift of resources and jobs, and that's really horrific. But you're right, and that's what I thought it was. You're right, that is a whole other magnitude of terrible. And yeah, I think that's what this movie is great for. It's like it's not trying to say, oh, one side is justified, one is not. It's trying to say, look, that all of this is terrible, and how do we break out of that's not like the nuclear bombs are horrible and bad, but it's not like all of warfare before the nuclear bombs was great.
Right.
That it's all bad and it all needs to end.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, thank you for a great discussion. Listeners, of course, we want to know what you think. Have you seen the original? Are you now interested in seeing the original now? What did you think about Gojira and the Godzilla movies and all that? Love to hear from you. Whatever your perspective is, definitely write in. You can find all the ways to contact us on the Ethical Panda website. And I'll get to that more in a second. But first, I just want to give us a quick piece of feedback. A lot of the feedback we've been getting that I want to go through is about stuff that Paul hasn't seen yet, so I don't want to spoil Paul. But this one piece of feedback is something that Paul and I talked about that Paul hasn't seen, but he's wanting to come on a podcast and talk about it. And it comes from New Jersey Jedi. I'm going to call you NJJ. I hope that's okay. Just listened to you talking about animal rights in Guardians 3. Great episode, and it left me wondering. Paul, parentheses, and Matthew, but especially Paul, if you could create a superhero movie that was about animal rights, the way others have been about racism or sexism, etc., what would it be like?
First of all, that's a great question, and thank you for the question. Second of all, as chance would have it, I actually watched Guardians of the Galaxy 3 last night.
Oh, okay.
And have a couple things I want to say about that, but I'll circle back to that. Yeah, it's funny. Like, I come up with a lot of story ideas, but I really haven't come up with any story ideas in terms of like, really in terms of animal rights, Okay. I'm gonna give you my supervillain plan. So there's this, I could know the details of it, but it's actually not really relevant to my interests. There's some disease that makes people allergic to eating meat.
To any people listening to this podcast from governmental agencies, this is purely a hypothetical discussion that, as TikTok would tell me to say, is for education. No, it's for entertainment purposes.
For entertainment purposes only. Yeah. So there's this thing that literally makes people allergic to eating meat. And I believe it's delivered by like ticks or something, which actually complicates the plan because I don't really want to use ticks in my distribution method. But if I were to write a supervillain, I would have their plan. Basically, they would be an animal rights activist who decided they were going to spread this to all of the people. And they would probably be successful, and I would probably have a hero who was trying to stop them and then change their mind. There's my story.
So not even the sort of Black Panther, the villain has some good ideas but goes too far, at least for us, sensitive audiences, so therefore has to be stopped. But just flat out, like, the villain wins, and we get to the end where the villain's about to push the button, and the hero could stop them, but the hero's like, "Nah, go ahead,
go for it."
Yeah,
have your moment. Yeah, and I mean, the details obviously, you need to work out. The challenge for me is a lot of like what we were just talking about having a message that you want to share or something you want to encourage people to think about. And finding a way to do it that doesn't feel too on the nose, right? Like that doesn't doesn't feel like you're not telling a story, like you're just telling someone what to do. You know, I'm not big on telling people what to do. I mean, I'm happy to tell people, oh, I think that's an awful thing to do, you know, but not like, you should do this, you should not do this, you should, you know, and like, so yeah, I think finding a way to actually present that in an organic storytelling, you know, telling a great story while having stuff like that going on, I think is just so much more effective than just being like, okay, this is my message, how am I going to distribute it? You know, like, and so like when you asked the question, my first thought was like, oh, I don't even know. And I was like, oh, wait, I came up with a supervillain plan for a totally not me supervillain to do this thing. And then like, oh, what if there's a hero who's trying to stop them and maybe they actually change their mind, you know? You know, maybe they don't, but you know, you got to make the characters first and then let the characters tell you what they want to do is kind of my philosophy. But you know, you make enough characters with enough interesting perspectives. And I think, yeah, because the other thing is like, I mean, am I going to have a superhero who basically just goes around and liberates animals? And then, I mean, because that's a thing, like people do that and they get sent to prison for like terrorism for like, like there's people doing like 10 years or something for like kidnapping in quotes, like, or quote unquote, stealing 2 pigs who like weren't gonna even be like, who are of no financial value to the company because they've got such powerful lobbies, you know? I mean, like, you know, what would I want to write? I'd want to write some like Dexter thing where like someone just goes around and kills all these people, but it's like, that's not actually going to change anything, you know? So like, that's not what I'd write. Probably. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah.
To be continued.
Yeah. I mean, and I do like the way that you frame it of, because if that, you know, allergy got to all of humanity, like, I'm someone who eats meat. I eat significantly less meat than I used to, and I eat meat from... I've tried to divorce myself entirely from the factory farming system and focus on things that are, you know, more ethical and more caring to the quality of life of the animals and the like. And that's entirely because of my friendship with you. And I mean, and that causing me to learn more about those things and become educated about factory farming industry and things like that. And so on the one hand, I can say you're good at convincing people. You know, we've also been friends for 25 years, and I just mostly made these changes about 4 or 5 years ago. So, you know, a policy of everyone take 21 years to change one person's opinion is not the most efficient thing. But I always appreciate that, like, you have never, you know, we have maintained a friendship while I am engaging in something that you find, you know, very against your morals. And to me, I do agree that that kind of attitude of the try to persuade when you can. But even then, I'm like, because honestly, I think there's some things where, like, I'm not as forgiving as you are, and I do cut people out of my life for that kind of a thing. But I also understand where you're coming from with it. But my point being that I think, like, something like that allergy thing, no one is actually harmed. Like, I enjoy meat, and if I couldn't enjoy that anymore, would that reduce my quality of life in some regards? Yeah. Would it probably improve my quality of life in terms of my health? Yeah. Would I probably within a year just get so used to finding ways to enjoy plant-based food that I would stop caring about it? Almost assuredly, yes. And yeah, so I think it's a very interesting sort of take on it, as well as the idea of, like, I like that you didn't actually answer the question about the hero. You sort of more went for the villain, you know, because I think the Harley Quinn animated show, I think is doing something really fascinating from a similar perspective, because it's really about saying, like, they're not giving believable, relatable villains, but still have a hero who eventually has to stop them. It's straight up just a show about villains. And they do horrible things. They kill people left and right. But, and sometimes it's because they have a very righteous cause, and sometimes it's because, you know, they cut in line when they're trying to get a sandwich.
Well,
but like...
that's a righteous cause. I mean, well, it depends on what's in the sandwich.
I mean, but Ivy especially is very much kind of where you're coming from. She's not animal rights, she's more environmental rights.
Yeah.
But she's very much like, yeah, I'm just going to kill all these terrible people. And she's presented as a villain, but also as a hero. Mm-hmm. You know, in that I think we're supposed to be rooting for her. If occasionally, like, maybe I wouldn't go quite as far as you're going. But But yeah, so I think there's a really interesting space to explore there about like what does it mean to be a villain, and that's a whole other topic that we're going to get into lots of discussions about. But yeah, I really like that I answered that question. And
yeah, first of all, I really love what you said about, you know, gradually convincing and not it's just, I'm not trying to convince you by saying you should do this. It's just, I do think like if you just live your life and do what you think is right, you know, like other people see that and think about it the same way you can make a movie that presents these questions and then people can think about it. And some people will change and some people won't. Most people won't, but some people won't.
We can never go on a tangent without leading to 3 other tangents. That's just the way we are. If you're still listening, you know that about us. Enjoy more tangents. There's been a lot of discussion, especially because of what Jonah Hill apparently said to his now ex-girlfriend. But putting that aside, it led to larger discussions about the difference between setting a boundary for yourself versus setting a rule for someone else. And I think you are a great example of that because you have never asked me not to eat meat. You've never asked me to, change the way what I do. But you have said that you will not go to a restaurant that serves meat. And so part of what that meant was that when I wanted to have, and you were often like, yeah, look, you would often even just say, like, I'm not even going to hang out. We can find ways to hang out that aren't over food.
Yeah, there's other
but just if I invited you to a restaurant that had meat, you wouldn't go. And so there were some times where I was like, yeah, let's hang out after dinner because I do really want to go to this place. And sometimes I was like, yeah, okay, let's go to some places that are not going to have the food that I love the most, but are still going to be good food. And went to a couple of places that I hated, but was happy for the company. And then later, especially, was looking at more cuisines, but also as just vegan food science has really increased. We're now at the place where we can consistently find things that we're both happy to eat at. And so I just wanted to highlight that as a great example of this idea of having a boundary versus then you have a boundary that means that because I like interacting with you, I choose to change my behavior. Yeah. But you've never made it a rule for me. And never like tried to veto like what I eat. It's just your boundary. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and the Guardians of the Galaxy, I feel like I should have a better response to that. You could cut this.
We can take out the whole thing.
No, I think it was great. I just felt my response was underwhelming.
I felt a tad bit blown off, but that's okay.
No, yeah. Let me. This is a bit of a ridiculous sentence, but I appreciate you appreciating that, and I appreciate the number of times that you've been like, yeah, I'll go to this place that I don't know if I'm gonna like it or not, and like sometimes you didn't, and sometimes you did, I think once we found like some vegetarian Indian places like that, that was like a pretty good sweet spot, I think. In terms of Guardians of the Galaxy 3. I won't get too deep into it, but like my main things are like, one, if you thought that was super graphic, like it wasn't super graphic. It was like a little bit. I mean, it confronted you with a lot of the horrors that humans do to non-human animals, but then gave you this like over the top villain that maybe you didn't have to feel so bad, Yep. And then completely undercut itself in the very last scene where Rocket and company are just like, oh, here's a bunch of animals. Oh, do you feel bad? Nah, not really. Let's just shoot them all. And I was just like, and it was fun. I was watching with Zen Madwoman, and as she has said, she prefers to be called on these things. And she was just like, what was that? Like, why was that scene there? And it reminded me of, when we were talking about Loki. And like Loki being like, oh, I'm bisexual. Now let me kiss a woman. So none of you have to have uncomfortable feelings about this. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like, I feel like that is a movie that will make a lot of people think about things that they hadn't thought about before. And I really appreciate that. But like, do we have to like undercut the message, Yeah. And that I would not put in. I'll just put that out there. So, yeah.
No, I think it's very fair. I think that was, and I think we were critical of that at the time.
Yes.
I certainly felt the same thing. I was like, why did this happen? Because it was like that. Plus, it's funny. I'd even forgotten about how horrible that scene. I just thought you meant when like we see them like eating animals on sticks.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So
But yeah, definitely good points. Here's the funny part. We'd gone so long that I thought we were in the Patreon section already. That's why I kept saying, why don't we do it next time, because then it'll be in the Patreon section.
I know. I was like...
New Jersey Jedi, thank you so much for asking the questions. Everyone else, keep sending in questions. You can find all the ways to do so on theethicalpanda.com. I am still on Twitter. Eventually, I'm going to decide to get off Twitter. I don't have the energy and time, unfortunately, to create like 5 different accounts on the 5 different things that are currently trying to replace Twitter. If one or two of them emerge as kind of the real dominant ones, or if eventually I get kicked off Twitter, because I will keep calling it Twitter, and I will keep calling people cisgender, both of which I've heard are now becoming bannable offenses. They're not really, but who knows what'll happen. We'll see. But for now, you can find me on Facebook, email, Twitter, TikTok. You can technically find me on Instagram. I don't do much there, but if you send me a message on Instagram, you can find it. Pretty much search for The Ethical Panda in any of those places. But best thing is just go to theethicalpanda.com. Paul, I know you can find as Zen Madman, is more a work in progress at the moment, but Paul has written a lot of great books in the past and is in the process of fermenting different ideas that will eventually come true. Hopefully they will be more in the writing stories, not me trying to visit him in prison. But we will see.
They won't catch me.
Yeah,
Please.
of course. Because we certainly don't have a recorded record that will be available to the public.
That's not what I mean by catch. I mean physically.
No, okay.
Apprehend. Yeah.
That's true. But point is, send us all the feedback. Best way to support us is being a Patreon. If you go to our Patreon, you can support us. I think it's just like $5 a month. And you get access to ad-free content. You get access to additional content in our Patreon sections. And right now, especially, 25% of all the money I get from Patreon is going to be donated to the educational fund. The Entertainers Fund, which is being used to help people affected by the strike, both in the unions and also out of the unions. In terms of like Paul's parents were not actors or directors, but like your parents would probably be out of work right now. They worked in other kinds of parts.
They were in other unions, yeah. Well,
yeah.
They could probably do commercials, but anyway, yeah. It affects a lot of people. When you shut down a production, it affects a lot of people.
The makeup people, the caterers, and some of it is like the official movie caterers. Some of it's probably, I'm sure there's a pizza place next to some of these lots that just gets a ton of business delivering pizzas to the studios. All those are suffering now. So yeah, 25% of it goes to that. So Patreon content about love triangles coming in just a second. But for everybody else, thank you all so much for listening.
We have spoken.